Okay, good evening, everyone. We are up to the second part of our Exploring Religious Zionism series, and I'd like to discuss tonight Chovevei Tzion, political Zionism, and cultural Zionism. As Hashkacha would have it, tonight is actually the 150th yahrzeit, Hey Cheshvan, of Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, who we discussed last time somewhat briefly. So I'd like to discuss him further, as tonight is his 150th yahrzeit. I also have to make a few corrections from the shir last week. I may have misspoken. So first of all, correction number one, someone asked if there were any Jews living in Israel at the time that the Talmidei Hagra, the students of the Vilna Gaon and the students of the Baal Shem Tov came to the land of Israel. And the answer is yes, certainly there were. We were discussing the first large group of immigration, but certainly we know there were Jews living in the land of Israel. We know the whole Chabura in Sfas, the Beis Yosef Cairo, the Alshech, many of the mystics that we know of in that community in Sfas. We know the Ramban, they made the shul in the old city, and he came to the land of Israel. There was a small settlement of Jews who were living in the land of Israel prior to the Talmidei Hagra and the students of the Baal Shem Tov. So I just want to get that correction. Correction number two. I said that Rabbi Akiva Eger and the Chasam Sofer were in correspondence. Nice new glasses. They're not new.
But thank you.
Okay, well they look good.
And I bought them online.
Okay, well you don't always wear those. You do always wear them. Okay, so I have to make a correction in the corrections.
You just noticed me anymore.
Oh no. It looks different for some reason. Okay.
I washed.
You washed it, okay. Correction number two is that Rabbi Akiva Eger was actually the father-in-law of the Chasam Sofer. They were very similar ages, but Rav Moshe Sofer was the son-in-law, and Rabbi Akiva Eger was the father-in-law. And then correction number three, if you were paying attention to the discussion about bringing the karbanos, we talked about Rav Kalischer's dream to reinstitute the sacrifices on the Temple Mount prior to the coming of the Messiah. So I mentioned something, but I really just misspoke. I mentioned about the Karban Pesach, how it's a discussion if the owner, not the Kohanim, could shecht. It's not correct. It's an explicit Gemara, it's an explicit Mishnah. The owners could slaughter the Karban Pesach. The question and debate really that I mentioned has to do with Hallel, who says the Hallel, but everyone agrees it's a Gemara, explicit Gemara, that the owners of the Karban Pesach, the Yisraelim, right, the Jewish people, that we don't have to have clear lineage in terms of their Kohanic status, their priestly status, they would be able to slaughter the Karban Pesach. So, as I mentioned, we're going to go more into depth in Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, as tonight is his 150th yahrzeit. He was born in Lisa. As I mentioned before, he was a student of Rabbi Akiva Eger and Rav Yaakov Loiberbam, the Netziv HaMishpat, also the one who wrote the Chavas Das. And he lived in Lisa, which was an area in Prussia. It was really originally Poland, but then it was sort of subsumed by Prussia later on, which becomes Germany. And he then becomes the rabbi in Turin. We discussed last time his messianism. We focused a lot on his belief that we can now bring the redemption with human activity. But I really want to talk about a few other things, and generally, where did his new approach? We talked about his revolutionary approach, which predated Herzl, predates Chovevei Tzion, predates Zionism by decades. So where did this come from, and what drove him to this idea? Just to give you what drew him to this idea. Just to give you his the years that he lived. He was born in 1795 and passes away in 1874. And already in the 1830s, he's talking about, right, bringing sacrifices. He's writing to Rothschild, which I want to go more into depth with today. So where does this come from? I have a friend who's a Jewish history historian, Yehuda Geberer, who has a wonderful podcast, and he has a great summary of what he believes are the historical factors, or maybe the backdrop to what led Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer to his revolutionary approach of resettlement, of advocating the mass immigration to the land of Israel, and all of these things. So it's really three parts that we have to understand. Number one, what led him to these ideas and his new approach was it became practical in his lifetime. At least he saw it to be. Muhammad Ali, who I mentioned last time, he's not the boxer, but he was the Egyptian. He was of Egypt. He controlled the area. It wasn't in that time. The land of Israel wasn't under direct control by the Ottoman Empire, and therefore Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer felt that instead of dealing directly with the Ottoman Empire, which would have been a more difficult task to convince them to deal with Jewish buyers of land, etc. You can sit right here, Paul. Right here is good. It's good. It's good. It's good.
I know I'm not that tall.
He felt that if he could get Muhammad Ali, who is somewhat of a rebel, who was he was the one in charge of the land of Israel at that time, he would be more easy than dealing with the Sultan of the large Ottoman Empire, and so he felt that the time had come that we have an opportunity. So number one, it became practical. Number two, he saw nationalism becoming popular throughout the world. Nationalism, which we could probably spend a whole lecture series on that very idea, but nationalism, very simply understood as the idea of self-determination, independence, a pride in your nationality, and Rav Kalischer and others saw it when Greece broke away from the Ottoman Empire in 1830 after a decade of fighting. This really inspired many other countries, the Polish Rebellion, the Revolution, of course, for the French Emancipation. All these things are starting to happen, and people are starting to not only believe in their national identity and self-determination, but actually put their lives in danger to free themselves from whatever country, whatever empires they were under. And this really takes us throughout the whole century, eventually the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And it really takes us to World War I and everything that sort of emerges from the idea of nationalism. And that's really what was happening. That was in the air at the time. Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, which we shall see today inside, actually references the idea of nationalism and says we can incorporate that, and we should incorporate that into our perspective of Judaism. And then the third and final concept, which I want to draw your attention to, which again, all of historical context for what led Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer to this new approach of resettlement of the land of Israel, was emancipation of the Jews of Europe. Emancipation, led the Jews to positions of power. There were now Jews in the banking world. There were Jews who were wealthy. There were the Rothschilds, the Moses Montefiore's, maybe Eliezer will help me out with this. Adolf Cremieux, the wealthy Jews that were in the positions of power that now could make cause political influence here. So that was both practical, and also Rav Kalischer thought that emancipation is the sign of the dawn of the Messianic era. So it's all these things converge into one, and it's not happenstance that Rav Kalischer notices different things going on in the world, and he comes to this revolutionary approach. Something that's really not at the heart of his, let's say, proto-religious Zionism. Maybe we should call him a proto-religious Zionist. Certainly was a very religious person. Something that's just unrelated, but I thought it was very interesting, so I thought that we'd talk about it a little bit. So it's Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer's approach to non-Jews. So in 1841, Isaac Marcus Jost, who is a German Jewish historian on the, let's say, more liberal side, he decides to write an open letter that basically argues that all anti-Gentile discrimination in rabbinical literature is no longer relevant, and he writes a long article in a Hebrew periodical, Tzion, calling for all distinctions to be null and void. Now, this is to understand the context. Like, this was also, there were burnings of the Talmud, there were libels, like people really had called into question the the morality of the Talmud, and he was saying, forget this, let's just abandon the whole thing. And he writes this open letter. Apparently, only one person responded, and that was a little-known rabbi from the city of Torin, and that was Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. In 1841, I found this article by someone who did a lot of work on Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, coming out with a new book. Asaf Yedidya, Professor Asaf Yedidya, has an article called "Between Reform and Apologetic: The Public Letter of I. M. Yost on Love Your Neighbor and Rabbi Z.H. Kalischer's Response." That's Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. And he writes that Rav Kalischer responds in 1842, he responds and he argues that we should adopt v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, to love your neighbor as yourself, to include non-Jews. Now, he's not the first one to do this. Actually, there are others, Rav Pinchas Horowitz and others, but and this is something that I took up in my analysis of Rav Sham Shafal Hirsch and his approach to non-Jews. I just thought it was interesting. You can probably take a look. I copied some of the article here. I find it very interesting that it seemingly is not related, but perhaps to his religious Zionism or Messianism. But he does talk about the idea that the whole purpose of the redemption is not just for the Jewish people; it's for every creature on earth, and it's for our light to shine on them, and all the nations will gain from this. And he writes in other places, which we'll see some of the letters, that we should not be taking the land of Israel by force. And he definitely had, in many areas, I think, a different approach than many of his colleagues. And I thought it's interesting to see him in this light, responding to a liberal Jewish historian, not adopting his complete redaction or abandonment of the distinctions between non-Jews and Jews. However, he is willing to go so far to say that we need to love all of humanity based on the pasuk that is usually interpreted by most authorities only referring to Jews. He says v'ahavta l'recha kamocha applies to non-Jews as well. He also has some interesting psakim, open, I guess, like you could say open-minded psakim, different than some of his colleagues in Choshen Mishpat. He wrote a very important work on Choshen Mishpat, Moznayim Mishpat, and Mishnah Achrona. It's used by people learning Choshen Mishpat. It's a classic, and in there he argues for the ability. It's a whole discussion in Talmudic literature and in Tosavos whether a woman could be a dayan, or if she could be a judge on a legal beis din, and he argues that yes, she can based on Devora, but. Without getting into all of that, it's just interesting to see the different, I would call him, open to reinterpreting or open to evaluating some of the things that maybe his colleagues were not. Although, as I mentioned before, he was certainly not a reformist. He battled strongly against the reformers of his time, but he seemed to be very open to different ideas and reevaluating the current situation of the Jewish people well before it even was adopted by the actual formal movements. So I touched on this idea of nationalism. I'd like to show you where he actually talks about incorporating nationalism into our approach. So you may have heard of this citation. Some quote Rav Sadia Gaon as saying that we are only a people through our Torah. And this is in Amunah V'Deos, or Amunah V'Deos. Rav Sadia Gaon says this. Now, it is sort of like a throwaway line there, but a lot of people quote Rav Sadia Gaon as saying that our nationality is not defined by what other nations define. It's their land, it's their culture, it's their language. He said, no, Rav Sadia Gaon already said that it's just the Torah. Now, some, I guess, traditional approaches would argue that there are secondary values, or there could be some things that we could view as maybe nationalistic or giving us some sort of Jewish culture, but they're certainly not essential to our identity. But Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer felt that we can incorporate nationalism, and actually we need to incorporate a sense of nationalism. And he writes this in Drishas Tzion, which we mentioned last time was his work, sort of a small pamphlet, but much later in life. He wrote articles and incessantly wrote letters to people and tried to convince him. We spoke about it last time. Rav Shamshon Hirsch, he wrote letters and letters, and then only later Rav Hirsch writes to Rav Yaakov Lifshitz, the famous secretary of Yitzchak Chon Inspector, that Rav Kalischer wrote to me many times to try to convince me of this, and he told me I'm the one who's preventing the redemption, and I told him what you think is a great mitzvah, I believe is no small sin. You remember that? So Rav Tzvi Kalischer was writing many letters, and you see, very interesting, we'll see, the ideas that he had in the 1830s come to full maturity and develop later on in his work in Drishas Tzion. But Drishas Tzion was sort of the compilation of all these articles and these writings that he had, arguing for, again, support of the immigration to the land of Israel. He had also ideas of schooling, of we have to start learning how to actually work the land and get the Jewish people off the Chalukah system, like we mentioned before. The old Yeshuv was based on handouts and support from the diaspora communities. So he felt we need to start becoming independent and work the land. And he talked about giving money to the people, to develop schools, to develop institutions. He had these different ideas of bringing karbanos we mentioned before. This is all in Drishas Tzion. And he, founding these agricultural schools, forming a Jewish military guard for the security he was thinking really very practically, very beyond his time. So Drishas Tzion has in it a passage here, which I want to read together with you in source number 2, where he touches on nationalism. He writes here, he says there's this idea of Avas, here he goes. He says there's an idea called nationalia or lu'umiyot, and nationalism. And he writes as follows. This is in source number 2 after the Aleph. Are we any lower than the other nations of the world? Asher damam rechusham ke'efes nechshav lamo neged avas artzim va'amam, that they look at their own blood and their wealth like nothing. When it comes to, or comparison to, the love that they have for their land and their people. In other words, they sacrifice themselves on the altar of nationalism. And that's why he called it Drishas Tzion, because he was saying, there is no one who is Doresh Tzion, there is no one who is seeking after our land. And that's why he calls it Drishas Tzion. And then he says, Simun Alev, look, pay attention to what is going on over here. Look around you. Ma asu anshe Italian. Right? What are the Italians doing? Poland. What are the Polish doing? Medinat Ungarin, Hungary. What are the Hungarians doing? Asher ashlichu nafsham mineged kasvsam v'zavam ad asher dak itchenu ruach tiseam avur shem nachas artzam. What are they doing? They're giving their lives for the purpose of their land. So therefore, va'anachnu b'nei Yisrael, us, the Jewish people, asher ha'artzam u'forah, Misos kol haaretz, the Jewish people believe that our land, our Eretz Yisrael, is the joy of all the world. He says it's hilanu l'marasha, it's our inheritance. And what are we doing? We're going to do, he says something very provocative. Nasim yad lepeh. We cover our hand over our mouth. V'niya ki ish asher ein ruach bo. We're as if a person that has no spirit. He says, halo nivzenu be'enei nafshenu. It's, I guess, sort of a poetic line that we are disgraced in our own eyes or our soul's eyes. Im kol amim asu rak l'chvodam. What are these nations doing? What's nationalism? It's pride. It's kavod. It's we are Italian. We are Greek. We are Hungarian. Va'anachnu lo levad kavod avosinu. We shouldn't just the Jewish people shouldn't just do it for our forefathers, but we should do it. We should not do it for ourselves, not only for our forefathers, for the people who sacrificed for the land, for the people. We should do it for Hashem, because we believe that the world will gain, and our land is the land of Hashem. It is for God. And then he says, "In Beis chayavim anachnu la'azor la'achin b'nei Yisrael hadarim shamu." We need to help the Jews. We're already there. Then he goes on and on. But I wanted to show you that he mentions this idea of nationalism. He's not saying we don't believe in Torah and we have a new, right? There were those who said, at least the reform, to the most extreme reform was, we don't believe in the redemption because redemption has always already arrived. Because emancipation means redemption, and then Berlin will be the new Jerusalem, and we don't need to go back to the land of Israel. Rav Kalischer believed that emancipation was a sign of the redemption, But that doesn't mean that we abandon the process of the human efforts have to come, but then we need God to do the second step. And in this, so that's sort of like he's in the middle. He's sort of, he's not breaking from tradition. At the same time, he's saying we have to start the process. And in a similar way, when it comes to nationalism, he's not saying, okay, the Torah is not our identity. We need to form a new Jew, right? That's what comes later, which we'll see. The whole debate about what is religious Zionism anyways. And what is Zionism? And is there a new perspective, culture? We'll get to that hopefully. But Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer is not saying we're going to redefine things. He's saying we've forgotten what we've been trying to accomplish all along, and that is I don't think he's saying we should incorporate nationalism, at the expense of Torah. He's saying, learn from the world. Look at what's happening around us, and that should remind us of what we have, and that we should stand up for it. If they're willing to risk their lives for it, just for their own sense of nationalism, we should also be proud of what we are, and not just that we're just a nationalistic thing. We're actually a people that believe in God and bringing the world to a recognition of God.
There's a question though.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. So I was under the impression that there's always been this yearning, and a very Torah-based, like in our souls, yearning for the next year in Jerusalem.
We pray for it every day. Yes.
And so the idea that there was a lost transmission of this.
Right. So Rav Kalischer is pointing out that people weren't interested, and they were sort of happy, or it wasn't so easy to be a Jew in Prussia and in Poland in those days. It was not easy, but there wasn't this interest in resettlement. There wasn't.
Like
He was pushing it.
They find that so beyond possible, like it's
Why they didn't support?
Because life is hard already, and then you have this promised land that we've come from, that we've been exiled from. So of course, and it's like we say it next year in Jerusalem, like it's every Jew.
You're asking why didn't people adopt his approach?
Yeah,
We saw, so one of the things we saw last time was Rav Chaim Shmuel Hirsch with the 3 shvuos, the 3 oaths. And it was more of a theological opposition, and he supported people who moved to the land of Israel. But Rav Hirsch, to summarize his opinion, I think we saw last week that it's not our role to bring the redemption. God will bring the redemption, right? We have to do the best we can. That's a theological response, but why didn't people get on the bandwagon? They're probably just like, don't bother me, I need to make a living and, go to shul, And the rabbis, weren't so keen on bringing sacrifices to the Temple Mount. And you see that this idea of bringing karbonos, even in religious Zionist circles, it never really took off. It never really. But that was his. He felt these are real steps that have to happen. He wrote to wealthy Jews. Why didn't they listen to him? They probably thought it was some fanatical, dreamer. I think probably most people thought he was a well-intended dreamer, probably. But you'll see in a moment a little bit of what I think is his influence, and what he did move forward.
A lot of the people at the time were very. There was the Toranic group, very much religious in culture, religious in nature, and going to Eretz Yisrael was only a component, and it would sacrifice the entire basis of Torah. You couldn't.
They didn't have the same infrastructure there.
So you had
right.
an infrastructure of yeshiva, you had Torah, you had learning things of that nature, and this was a piece of the puzzle.
It's an important point.
Of anything else.
Yeah.
So the Netziv already said, and I think you quoted them. You basically said, they said, why don't you come to Eretz Yisrael? And they said, they said, right? You stay in your Yerushalayim, we'll stay in our Yerushalayim, referring to Berlin. And at the time, so
So we're going to get to the Netziv. I don't think I quoted the Netziv yet, but we're going to get to the Netziv. Even by the Netziv's time, people started. Chovevei Tzion was being founded. This is well before that. So I think Laser is making a good point in the sense it wasn't even like an option. It's like go out to know there's nothing there. Where's the rabbi, the yeshiva, the cheder, we're talking about totally uninhabited area. So it was almost like it's not even a realistic thing. But Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, he was not shy, and he was not going to be turned away. And for 40 years, he writes letters, he petitions for this. And one of the letters that I touched on last time, I wanted to show you. There's a beautiful printout. You can take a look at his beautiful handwriting. A letter he wrote to Asher Anshel, or they call him sometimes Amsel or Amschel, Rothschild, in 1832, if I'm not mistaken. And you can see this is a letter printed in the Mosada Rav Kook Drishas Tzion. They have a whole facsimile of the. They have a whole facsimile. Sorry, 1836. I apologize. A whole facsimile of the actual letter, and I wanted to just show you. I think we referenced this briefly, but I wanted to read the language in the letter to show you that it parallels very much what he writes later in the Drishas Tzion in the 1860s. He says to Rothschild, he says, Geulas Yisrael Mashiach Tzidkenu. This is in source number 3. Asher anachu cholchem lo kol hayom. Right, the redemption that we yearn for every day, like Rachel, like you were saying, that we are. That is something that is traditional. We are like looking for. But what do people think? They think, okay, God will drop it down from some of the letter to Rothschild, Igeres Hapiniya, Rav Kalischer, Asher Anshel Rothschild. People are going to say, Pitzom Yered Hashem Yisbarach Shemo Mishamayim Haaretz. God will drop the Messiah down from heaven. And he says, no, it's not going to happen like that. Lo Ken Adoni. He says, no, it's not just going to happen one day in a moment. Lo Chipazon Yom Echad. It's not going to be at haste in one day. Rather, at Rak Ma'at Tavo Gulas Yisrael. It's going to happen slowly. La'at Tatzmiach Karen HaYeshua. It's going to happen through a process. But look at the language he says. This is already in 1836. He says, Reishis HaGeula Tia Al Yedei Siba Tivis Mibnei Adam. That's the key line there. The beginnings of the redemption will happen through the natural cause of human beings. That will be the human initiative. And Rothschild does not even bother to respond to him. So as I mentioned, you would have thought, first of all, not to write to the most wealthy Jews. You would never think to write to such a person. Not only that, after you wrote to him, poured out your soul, write this long letter, he doesn't respond to you, okay, that's it, No, Rav Tzvi Kalischer kept pushing for 40 years. And I want to say that a couple of the things of his legacy, he did put a lot of time and energy into what's called the, I'm going to say this wrong, but it's French, the Alliance, we'd say the Alliance, which was founded in 1860, which was a French organization basically to help all Jews around the world. And he also was very influential on Moses Montefiore.
I guess it's alliance from.
Yeah, the Alliance, the Moses Montefiore, who was also, both those organizations were instrumental in the founding of the first settlements in the land of Israel. So he didn't see the immigration en masse that he envisioned during his lifetime. He probably felt, I would say, I imagine, we don't know for sure, isolated from his rabbinic colleagues who didn't really, I don't know if it went as far as with Hirsch as saying he's not doing a small sin, but at least the people who didn't, support him and decide, okay, of course, this is the new the new thing we should be focusing on. They pretty much status quo remained. However, I think there were things that he started moving the needle in such a way that the idea started to become a little bit more on people's radar, and I think he had direct influence over people and an organization, the Alliance, that were very. They were influenced by him and were fundamental to the beginnings of the new Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. Yeah.
I found it fascinating, that there wouldn't have been resistance for him from the religious community of using sort of the Chukat Goyim approach of saying
nationalism,
that we're adopting something
right.
that is a foreign concept. Like there are other ways to make the argument that you could pull from. You could pull from appointing a king in Dvarim. You could appoint, that there are reasons that you can use rather than so there'd be resistance to using that to.
So last week we did go through. Right, I hear you. Last week we did go through a lot of his argumentation, the way he read B'Haviyos and Nahar Kochi, the Psukim in Yeshayahu, and we did go through some of the religious arguments. I found it interesting specifically because of that. In other words, I found him surprisingly open, although he's a rabbi of the old school, but surprisingly open to seeing the progression around, seeing, nationalism, seeing emancipation, seeing women's roles in a little bit of a different way, which we didn't really go through in depth. But and his understanding of non-Jews, I don't want to paint him as a modern Orthodox thinker. I don't think that's to be accurate, but he definitely was, I would say, cued into the zeitgeist, where he knew what was happening in the world, and he said, "Look at the world and see what's happening." I don't know if he was saying we should adopt nationalism. I think he was saying we can learn from it. We can see if they're proud of their land and they're putting in all this energy. What about us? What happened to our traditional beliefs and our messianic emunah that we always had? And we're not going to be, at least as much, as Hungary and Poland and all these people are dedicated to their own country. We're just going to say, whatever.
There's a question to you.
Another question. Okay. Yeah.
I know Herzl comes after him, but does he? A lot of the things you're saying that he's saying seem to resonate. Does he ever refer to him?
Herzl. First of all, I don't know if we're going to get to Herzl tonight, but Herzl is born, just trying to find my notes here, maybe 1860,
1904.
and Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer is writing to Rothschild in 1836.
Right.
And he passes away in 1874.
Right. But,
Well before Herzl even gets onto the scene.
So-
Herzl's only on the scene, and we'll see, interestingly enough, for only 8 years.
I understand, but does he not maybe
No, his works.
does he not refer to him later?
So
After?
Moshe Hess does refer to Rav Kalischer in one of his writings, but again, Rav Kalischer, like I said before, he was almost not known, not even really referenced, and even today in religious Zionist schools, they'll spend maybe 20 minutes on him. I find it to be a fascinating thinker, but we'll see some thinkers and some names that you've probably heard of before that come about through the Chovevei Tzion organization. But Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer predates all of that. There's no institution. He helps with the Alliance, founding of the Alliance, but it was not a religious organization. It was a secular French organization. So it's just fascinating. He is mentioned. I think he's somewhat of a lost figure, and that's why I wanted to dedicate a specific, a significant amount of our shir tonight, as it is his 150th yahrzeit. Okay, moving on to Chovevei Tzion or Chibas Tzion. There's not a lot of names for the. It's not even one organization, but many different organizations that started to take off and are founded. So let's begin with Chovevei Tzion. Chovevei Tzion, which was led by Leon Pinsker. You'll see the picture that I have over here. And Leon Pinsker was not a very religious person necessarily, but he was the one who was the head of the Chovevei Tzion organization. Starts to take off and garner support. Most notably, in 1884, there was a conference, the Katowice Conference, and you can see that this is the picture from the participants, and right in the middle, in the front row, is Leon Pinsker, and right next to him is Rabbi Shmuel Maliver. Rabbi Shmuel Maliver, who was very close with the Chovevei Tzion organization. He was one of the leaders of it. He was a respected Talmid Chacham. He lived from 1824 to 1898. He was a student of the Netziv, and he gave a lot of credibility and legitimacy when it came to the religious community to the Chovevei Tzion organization. You can see another 1890. Here's another General Assembly in Odessa. And here is really at this stage, it's getting in the air. People are talking about the resettlement. People are starting to move. The Rothschild colonies begin to be established at the end of the 19th century. Rishon LeZion, Zichron Yaakov, Rosh Pinah, Ekron, and Rav Shmuel Maliver is very much involved in many of these initiatives. Rav Maliver is the first to deal with the Shemitah issue in modern day practical way. As I mentioned to you, Rothschild was very involved in the founding of many of these agricultural settlements, and he was not interested in having these farmers stop once every 7 years. And he said, I'm considering pulling the funding for these. I don't know if he really understood. Maybe these people don't want to work. Again, this whole process was very. They had connections and they were making alliances with people who weren't necessarily religious, weren't necessarily so in depth, in tune with all the the intricacies of Shemitah. And Rav Maliver comes up with this first ever heter mechira, and he gets two top rabbinic leaders to sign on to this heter for a temporary measure, and he gets Rav Yitzchak Kachan Inspector, the Kovner Rav, and Rav Yeshua of Kutna to sign on to the heter mechira in the late 19th century. And that just, again, it shows you both that Rav Yitzchak Kachan Inspector supported the Yishuv, which he was one of, arguably the head of the Lithuanian, Jewish community in Europe. But it also shows you Rav Shmuel Maliver's status. Right? He was able to push this thing through and really gave a lot of credibility to the Yishuv. But there were always constant, tensions between, some of the backers, the donors, the religious, the non-religious. But there was this movement, and it was sort of an exciting time, and a lot of it centered around, in different ways, the yeshiva Volozhin. And that is, I would say, first of all, many intellectuals, started off in Volozhin, and they, ended up in different places. It was a very open place in that regard. Just things. Maybe not even supposed to be official, but like unofficially, people were learning Maskilic literature. People were studying Hebrew. There were a lot of Zionist, undercover Zionist, meetings and different things. But besides for that, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva, known as the Netziv, as we shall see, was very supportive of the new settlement in the land of Israel. I just have a few pictures of a work that was put together later called Shibat Tzion, and you can see, first of all, Haskamos, rabbinical endorsements from Rav Yitzchak Kachan Inspector, as I mentioned before, and Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He was against heter mechira. Yes, the Netziv did not support heter mechira. Interestingly enough, but in Shivat Tzion, he writes a number of letters in support of the new yishuv, and this is already decades after Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. So you can see the date in this work, Shivat Tzion Tov Reish Nun Beis, which I guess would make it 1882, if I'm not mistaken. No, 1890. 1891. So it's a little bit after, and people are starting to move there, and there are people living there. Now, it's interesting, we'll see soon, the Netziv had certain qualifications that he wanted the people running these yeshuvim. He wanted them to be religious Jews. He wanted them to, live in terms of basic halachic obligations and different things, but he did support them in writing. So here, let's take a look in source number 4. So he writes here, we have to support those who are working the land, that are making lasos vad v'chevra, to make an organization and a society, lasof kesef, to gather funds, litmok adachinu ovdei adama ubali malacha, to help the people who are working the land and settling the land and making a living, be'eretz Yisrael v'Surya. Then he says here, Kikach olav b'ratzon Hashem lasos yishuv al yidei Yisrael b'artzina kadosha. If this is what Hashem wants, and it seems to be that the history is showing us that this is what is ratzon Hashem. He says we have to support, whether it's with physical support, bepula chumria, bepula ruchnius, whether it's with a spiritual way to print svarim to help them. And he says like this. Look at this line. You can see already that he's addressing questions were asked before about Why were people not supportive of this? So here you see, based on his argument, you can see what he's trying to address. Ve'ein lanu lachshov machshavos ki roi haya hadavar agadol hazeh ba'ofanim acherim. We should not contemplate, thoughts. We should not speculate that this great matter of the resettlement of the land of Israel should have occurred differently. Kasher mitzar deos b'nei adam, like some people think. Ki al zeh loko Moshe Rabbeinu, because that's what Moshe was cursed. What did Moshe Rabbeinu say to Hashem? Lo yaminu lo bi, right? He said they're not going to believe me. V'hein lo yaminu li, v'lo yishmu b'koli. When Moshe Rabbeinu has God appear to him at the sneh, the burning bush, so God says, you go back to the people, you tell them, Moshe, you're going to take them out of Mitzrayim. And Moshe's like, well, they're not going to believe me. And Hashem gets upset with him. And then Netziv uses this as a model. He says, what do people say? What are you talking about? Through these people who are working the land, that's what's going to bring the redemption. And doesn't even mention this, but we're going to get into the fact that many of them were not religiously observant. We're going to get into that. And people are going to say, well, maybe it'll happen in some other way. The Netziv is saying, don't think that. It's happening. This is going on. So don't try to say, well, maybe it should have been different. This is happening. Okay.
Was this all exclusively in the Ashkenazic community? That seems to be all our sources for now. Would we not have Jews from...
So Petach Tikva, which was an early settlement, we mentioned before, Rav Hirsch supported the founding of it. I'm not like I don't want to I had to make corrections this week from last week. I don't want to misspeak, but I believe that there were Sephardic Jews, specifically obviously the Chovevei in Tzvi that we mentioned before, right, much earlier, hundreds of years ago. This group and the general Chovevei Tzion movement seems to have originated primarily in Europe. What the historical reason for that is, I don't know. But that's we're talking about the Jews of Europe, the Jews of Eastern Europe. We'll talk about the differences between Western Europe. Herzl was from. Well, he's born in Pest. It becomes Budapest later, but he was definitely in the Western European world, which becomes a point of contention at some of the conferences, which we shall see. But I admit I'm ignorant in this area of the Sephardic movements and what happened. Many of them were living in Morocco. They were living in different places. They were living there in the 1500s, but so I don't know exactly what. I think the question is why didn't the Sephardic communities immigrate to the land of Israel at the same time? I mean, definitely the Jews of Morocco later come. We know obviously there was a mass immigration from the Jews in France and other places that were Sephardic, but I don't know the history. Then he goes another letter in source number 5, also collected in Shivat Tzion. The Netziv writes. Again, responding to those who are saying, well, you're going to work together with the likes of, Leon Pinsker and all these, people who are getting on board and Rothschilds and all of the people you're going to you're going to be the politician, you're going to work with these people. These aren't even from Jews. He says like this. He says, well, when Ezra HaSofer, when Ezra the scribe, when he gathered Jews from Babylonia, so... He says, "Kimosha b'mi Ezra HaSofer shekibatz eza alafim bebavel mikol sugi b'nei adam." When he gathered thousands of people to go on Aliyah, he got them from all different kinds of people. Gedolei Torah v'yer Hashem v'gam yosem anashim nosei nashim nachrios. Also, people who married non-Jewish women. Asher hayu murgolim b'chilul Shabbos. People who didn't keep Shabbos. V'lo yidu as a Torah klal, they didn't even know Torah at all. Right, there's the well-known pasuk, I think I quoted on Rosh Hashanah in Nehemiah, where the people are crying, and it's Rosh Hashanah, and because they're crying because they don't know the Torah that they're reading, and he says, "Don't cry, it's a happy day." There's evidence in Tanakh that people who were coming back to the land of Israel were not the most educated. They didn't know some of the things that were written in the Torah. But he says, but they brought him anyways, and they came together. Kol elu niskabtzu vehechinu yishuv haaretz Ba'arim. They all came together to gather to the land and prepare the land and to settle the land with cities. That the land could then afterwards be filled with its children. Kain aleinu lehisorer lakol ratzon Hashem. We also have to be awakened to the call of the will of Hashem. Hanishma mikatza ha'olam v'ad katzeo. That is heard from one side of the world to the other. It's moving. People are talking. This is happening. And people are going to the land of Israel. And he says, we have to go and support these people who are gathering together. And he writes, Bichol suge b'nei Yisrael, with all kinds of Jews. So you could just imagine, you could see sort of what he's responding to, what the critics are saying. And Rav Tzvi, Rav Naftali Tzvi Herder Berlin, the Netziv, is expressing his disagreement with those who, the naysayers, and saying, even those who violated Shabbos, even those who have no Torah knowledge, if they're helping with the cause, if they're assisting with the new settlement, we have to work together with them. There's a beautiful story. I heard this from Yehuda Geber, again, in the Jewish History podcast. He said of Shmuel Maliver, who was, again, I mentioned, he was intimately involved in the settlements. He sent the Netziv the first bottle of wine that was produced in Rishon LeZion, made with all of the mitzvahs Atulia Ba'aris. They separated Truma, they separated Maestros, and they brought it to the Netziv in Volozhin, and he was so excited. You know the story? He put on, it's not true? Oh, you're smiling like, oh, it's like, but yeah, and he put on his Yom Tov, his Chag garments before drinking it, because he was so excited. He felt this is a Yom Tov. And so that's a famous story that is told about the Netziv drinking the wine of Rishon LeZion.
Continuation of the story.
Oh, there's more to the story?
Yeah. So they had this bottle and they kept. That's it. He passed it around. So all the Rabbanim did the same thing. And one was a wine connoisseur, and he refused to get to do this. And the reason why he didn't want to participate was because he was a big, he was a
Feinschmecker?
And he was so afraid that he was going to drink the wine and he was
not
going
like it
and say something divas ha'aretz. So he just exited. he just recused himself from the entire story and says, "I'm not getting involved in this," and things like that. But
the lesson of the story is we shouldn't be Feinschmeckers.
But he didn't want to say divas ha'aretz.
Right. So
he
that's
was
what.
afraid that he would come
very
to that
good,
point.
very good. So that's what people were feeling. So it was a very exciting moment in Jewish history. Things were starting to happen. Gil Pearl, who is a very interesting academic, and he's written a lot about the Netziv. He has a biography on the Netziv. So I was able to pull up one of his articles, and he talks about basically the points that we've made, that in his letters in support of the Tzion movement, or Chovevei Tzion, had many different names. We see that he makes his support. Look at source number 6. He makes his support of the settlements program contingent on the appointment of officers whose job it would be to enforce halachic observance in the new settlements. The modern and largely secular orientation of Dr. Pinsker and the Tzion movement led them to request that the Netziv drop this demand and offer unconditional support for the settlements. After all, they replied, since the Jewish communities of the diaspora does not employ force in mandating the halachic observance of its constituents, the new Jewish communities of Eretz Yisrael should be no different. And then it said, no, he remained steadfast. So you see, there's this tension where, at the one hand, he's saying we have to work together. We can't separate. We can't say things should have happened else. Otherwise, we have to work together. At the same time, he was trying to maintain sort of this control and this sort of this. You see echoes of this, like even today, it's trying to maintain the halachic. What's the word? Its own integrity of the movement, although he's still trying to work together with the different constituencies. So,
What's happening today? It's still
yes,
current.
it's still the same things happening today. So, which leads me to a very important. Wow, we're almost at 9. Okay, I don't think we're going. I told Omri that we're probably not going to get to Herzl today. So we're not going to get to Herzl today, but I want to leave you with one very interesting letter that the Netziv wrote, and we'll probably just have to end with this. I'm focusing a lot on the Netziv, I think, for many reasons, but I think you get to see in this letter both what he's arguing for, and then you can imagine sort of what the other side of the argument is. So Next time, I guess we'll do secular, political Zionism and cultural Zionism. Okay, so the Netziv, he finds that there was an essay written in 1879 in an article in a journal called Machziki Hadas, and this was written by the newly burgeoning ultra-Orthodox, some call Hungarian community, and these are all like new modern terms, but the Hungarian community had a journal, and in this journal, this author, who I don't know who the author was, he doesn't name him in the article, but in the letter, but this article sort of argued for isolationism and separating from the new movements that are occurring in the community. And the Netziv writes very, very fierce opposition, fiercely and strongly, persuasively against this perspective. And I'm very happy to tell you that I found in Rabbi Turchiner's blog, of all places, a translation that he wrote in 2011 of this tshuva. It's in Meshiv Davar. Meshiv Davar is a collection of the Netziv's writings, but it was, I think, published later. He wrote this in 1879. So you take a look. It's a long letter. I have almost the whole thing here for you. I just bolded some of the parts that I wanted to do together with you. But he says that the author of this article, he separates the Jewish people into three camps. There's the right wing, there's the left wing, and there's the middle. And he says it's not so clear. He's sort of critical of the author. It's not really very clear what you mean by right, left, and middle. He says, I do agree that there are three groups, but we're all, we're all within one people. And he writes as follows. Let me read this to you. Maybe we'll just do it in English for time's sake. Some of it I have to read to you in Hebrew, though. So the argument that the author makes is, it used to be that you could be a middle-of-the-road type of Jew, and you could be connected to people from the left and people from the right. But nowadays, the Beinonim, what he calls, it's not the case. We're so influenced, and we have to be so careful. We have to cut ties with anyone who's different from us, and because we're so weak and we can't be influenced. And the Netziv says, first of all, he says, no, that's not possible. And then he writes something very, very interesting. He says, you think that nowadays is when so many people are violating Torah and it's terrible and it's never been like this in history. He's like, it's not true. Just look at Tanakh. He says, look at the Gemaras, look at what they were doing. This was similar to what he wrote about Ezra. People were violating the Torah. This was happening. So don't think that this is the worst it's ever been and you can't have any friendships and connections with people that are different from you. Then he writes something that your suggestion, the Hama'arich, the author, that you're telling us, this Eitzah, Lios Nishmar, Midorzeli Pareid Zemizeh. We need to be distant and separate from each other. Kemoshe Nifrad Avraham Milot, which is this week's parsha. Okay. Separate, right? He says, you got to go to the left, I go to the right. If you go to the right, I can't be together with you, Lot. He says, you can't do this. He says, this Eitzah, Marach Eitzah Zo, Kasha Kecharvos Laguf, Kecharevos Laguf Ha'uma V'kiyuma. This suggestion is so painful. It's like, it's as harsh as the sword to the body of the nation and its existence. And he writes that this is going to destroy our people. If we separate from each other, if we, decide to have no connection with one another, it's going to be the end of us. And he writes very, very forcefully that we cannot separate from each other. I'll just read this one last part. He has a beautiful interpretation of Vihisha Amda. He says Vihisha Amda Lavosenu V'lanu in the Haggadah. What is the Vihi? The Vihi is not so clear what it's talking about. This is what stood us, give us strength throughout all the nations of the world. They all tried to destroy us. What is the thing that keeps us strong? So he says it is the fact that Hashem, we keep to the Dvar Hashem. We keep to what Hashem asks from us. And unfortunately, we try over time to assimilate into the nations of the world. And then he says, and even then, that we know that we shouldn't be trying to assimilate into the nations of the world, it's difficult for us to separate from society. He says, "Kashalino leisrachik mi'umas ha'olam." It's difficult for people to separate from society, from people who are friends, whether they're good friends or bad friends. Everyone has good friends and bad friends. It's difficult for people, although we know we need to. But what you're suggesting, he's saying, like, even from non-Jewish negative influence, that's difficult for us, and we need to be strong. We need to commit ourselves to the Torah, because that's what's prevented us from becoming totally destroyed over all the generations. But it should be hard for us. And what you're saying is we should separate ourselves from all types of Jews that are different from us. He says that's impossible. You can't do that. He says kach aleinu. Lasos lahachzik hadas laharbos Torah bebati midrashus v'lasos kol tachbulos she'efshar. He says, what should we do? You're saying separate from everyone. Well, I'm telling you, what we should do is we should increase Torah. We should increase, the encouragement of religion. And do everything we can to teach Torah in the public sphere. And not say, well, this person is he's not really the best type of Jew, and they're doing it for the wrong reasons. He says, absolutely not. We have an obligation to strengthen Torah as much as we can. So
sounds like Lubavitch a bit, does it not? Like reaching out, not isolating myself, but spreading it.
Keeping our value. The value of one people. That's the main part that the Netziv is saying. Yes, the Netziv is obviously aware of the fact that there are negative influences. He's not naive, but he's saying don't separate our people. And I think that the context of this letter is really important, and that's why I brought it up. It's not abundantly clear why is the Netziv so adamant about this, but I think what he's trying to do is trying to keep everyone together as the community is changing, as people are. It's very much, I think, in the same vein as his other letters. Like you see, there's sort of this. He's trying his best to keep things together, and eventually we'll see it breaks down, it fractures, and people they build different camps. But he's trying to keep everyone in one camp, and he's trying to say, we can't separate from our brothers and our sisters. We can't do it. And you're saying it's so much worse than it was. It's not. And you're saying that how can we work together with people who are going to be stand against everything that we believe in, and they don't believe in Torah? He says, well, we're one people, we're one nation. We can't separate. There's a lot to say, a lot in this letter. I thought it was an important letter. It's basically, it's really I would say one of the most impassioned pleas for Jewish unity, and I think it comes in the context of the Netziv seeing the different camps forming, and the camps are forming, and he's trying his best to keep everyone together. Whether he succeeds or not, is to be determined. We'll see next time. God willing, we'll do political Zionism, cultural Zionism, Western European Zionism, Eastern European Zionism, and then and probably lead us to religious Zionism. Okay, we'll hold it over here.
Comment?
Yes.